Power up. Welcome to Energypreneurs, where I bring to you the exciting new opportunities in solar power, battery, and electric cars. I'm your host, Sohel Hasni. I have been tracking and analyzing these technologies on LinkedIn and Twitter for more than 10 years. Now we meet on podcast. Okay, good morning, team. We met at a EV conference in Melbourne, and great to see. I was so happy that we bumped into each other, and you are one of the pioneer in Australia in EV, no?
Yeah, well, we have a pretty good group of people, and it's good to see you again. The country Australia is big in land but small in community. And so lots of people who are trying to push the EV agenda in the country. We all know each other. A lot of us compete against each other, but there's an overwhelming sense of shared purpose. And I think a lot of that comes down to Australia being probably one of the only developed countries globally where all of the EV activity is private sector driven. So it's actually an interesting kind of case study on what happens when a new emergent technology that receives government support kind of now almost universally globally among developed countries has no such support in Australia. And yes, that's right. And we've had like glimpses here and there. So we've had some infrastructure funding, we've had some project funding, but nothing like federal. So nothing from the Commonwealth Australian government. A lot of state-based activity, mostly around charging infrastructure, but like nothing cohesive. No CO2 standards, no targets, no direct financial incentives.
Yeah, what happened in Australia and the solar suddenly came in a little late, some might argue, but then Australia did extremely well. So one can only hope.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly
right.
And
when it changed, Australians being early adopter, things will change very fast.
Well, we are early adopters. And I think one of the great kind of sadnesses is that the choice that consumers normally have when it comes to motor vehicles will be eroded because of a lack of understanding about EVs, but also lack of choice. Australia is I think we're one of the most competitive car markets in the world. We sell 1 million vehicles a year, new vehicles a year typically, but we have 70 car brands. It's one of the most competitive markets in the world. So consumers are spoiled for choice. But EVs, not so much, because we don't have the buying power to bring them in. We don't have the incentives to bring them in. So car manufacturers are just bringing their other stock.
Now, you have a startup working on the charging infrastructure, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Tell me a bit more. What are you doing? This sounds very exciting.
Yeah, so I've got actually, I'm involved in two businesses. The first I started in 2013 called Jet Charge. And we are essentially the people who ensure that the infrastructure gets out there. You kind of, when you think about EVs and EV charging infrastructure, everyone just assumes that the charging stations will get installed, right? So people say, well, we're going to have this many cars, we're going to have this many chargers, and that's pretty much the end of the conversation. But there's no one really looking at, okay, well, who's actually going to be doing it? Who's going to build up the expertise for charging, stuff like that? And so we started Jet Charge to solve that problem. And we're now the largest EV charging infrastructure deployment business in Australia. So we partner with almost all of the car brands in Australia who have an electric vehicle or about to have an electric vehicle. And we make sure that their customers are charged, their dealers, their head office. And then at the same time, because of challenges in relation to the electricity grid here and the electrical supply for a lot of the buildings and homes, we spent the past 3 or 4 years developing load management technology to basically get more EV charging stations into any given site. And we created that, and now we're looking to do that kind of business globally, because there's really not much out there. Most of the kind of stuff that I've seen overseas essentially has been, if we need this much capacity, we'll build this much capacity. And yeah, it hasn't been as constrained as Australia. Whereas Australia, we have to very carefully control what electrons go to which vehicles. So that's kind of Jet Charge. We're like the electrons kind of people who put the infrastructure in, maintain it, and make sure that the charging is in line with what the grid requires. And then I also started a business with some co-founders about 3.5, almost 4 years ago now, called ChargeFox. And ChargeFox is the largest EV charging network in Australia. So it's kind of like a mini Electrify America or Ionity. And we've built 22 now ultra rapid sites, 350 kilowatt chargers. We can charge a car up in about 20 minutes, connecting all of the major cities. But we also offer a software platform that manages charging stations. So yeah, most kind of charging stations, public-facing charging stations in Australia are on ChargeFox. Most users are signed up to it, and so we're just making sure that people can access and pay for the charges where required.
So these are like a subscription model, or you pay as you go?
Yeah, so you pay as you go for most of it, but our subscription model is not for users. Our subscription model is for vehicle manufacturers. So much like Electrify America and Ionity, we partner with the vehicle manufacturers and they pay us per vehicle sold. And then in return, those vehicles get either free or discounted charging on the ChargeFox network.
Yeah, it's like what Tesla was doing in early days, right? You get a charging free.
Yeah, in the very early days, I remember I've still got my Model S from 2013, and that came with lifetime free charging. And I think when Tesla was first kind of like getting going, they thought that was a really good idea until they started becoming successful and then realized how much it was going to cost them to give everyone free charging for life. So now it's actually really expensive to charge on the superchargers if you don't have that deal, like probably double or triple that of charging at home. And so, but yeah, our subscriptions is mostly for the vehicle manufacturers.
Yeah, I mean, eventually, as more and more houses have solar,
yes,
and solar efficiency increases, I mean, and the car charging requirement will not grow from, I don't know, 20 odd kilowatt hour a day max, right?
Yeah,
yeah. Not everyone drives 100 kilometer every day. So eventually this will shrink, right?
Yeah, I think it will shrink. I think you got fleets, which is one thing, they're always going to have their own requirements. But in Australia, we probably see about 50-50 kind of commercial sales versus retail sales. And so if you take just the retail amount, we kind of in Australia, we have about 20 to 25% rooftop solar penetration. And that's only going up. So it's the highest per capita kind of penetration in the world for solar. But for people who buy EVs, that's more like 60 to 75% have solar. And so, yeah, almost everyone charges from solar. They don't need to go out there and charge on public networks, which makes a public charging business really difficult because people don't have the confidence to purchase an electric vehicle until they see public charging infrastructure out there. But once they do purchase an electric vehicle, they do find that most of their charging happens in private. You still need the public charging infrastructure out there to kind of like on road trips and long trips. And you also want public charging to kind of coincide with retail, gyms and workplaces and stuff like that. But yeah, most people charge at home. I guess the question we're facing right now is would it actually be cheaper for people to charge in public? So that's something that we're grappling with because, if you're a big supermarket here, Woolworths, I'm sure you'll remember, like when you were here, like they have, hundreds of stores. They go on a national procurement kind of thing for electricity every year or every 2 years. Their cost for electricity is tiny, right? And so it may very well be in the future that they use that procurement power to kind of like subsidize the EV charging side or make it even free. And so the question is, if you do your daily shop, if you do like your supermarket shopping twice a week, would it be cheaper for you to go charge in a retail site? Not sure.
Yeah, I mean, they can even do, I think Coles still does it, that you get a docket and you take and you get some discount on your car.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's
So,
exactly
I mean, they
right.
can just say you can come and get up to 10 kilowatt hour free, which is
Yeah.
$22.50. It's nothing, no?
And it's not that interesting if we're just talking about the vehicle. So
Mhm.
if it's just getting fuel for your vehicle, as you said, you can charge from solar. A lot of people drive to work though, so sometimes like that may not always be suitable, but it's not that big a deal. I think where it does become a big deal is if you are using your vehicle as a battery for the home.
Mhm.
And so if you can charge for a really low cost or even free at a public site, at a fast DC charger, and be able to use that electricity to power your house for a couple of days or 3 days, that actually does make a big difference. And that's unlikely to happen just from solar, your rooftop solar. So that I think is where we're encouraging our clients to think, to say that this is a relationship not only with your clients' vehicles, it's actually a relationship with their home. And that's why they should invest in charging infrastructure.
Yeah, just one idea came into my mind. I mean, many years ago, RACV used to pay, I forgot, $60 and you'll get unlimited sort of time they will come and fix your car up. Then they realized that 90% people make 2 or 3 calls, and the remaining 1% or 99.1, that makes so many calls. So they were, I think at that time, they said, okay, you pay $66, you get 3 free calls, and then we'll charge you. So bringing that analogy to your supercharger, maybe that's a business model can work out. People just buy a subscription, very low, but gives them only maybe 3-4 charging requirements as an emergency. You will like to buy that insurance, but you may never use it. And then people charge at home. So you become an insurance underwriting, range anxiety insurance, those who have it.
Range anxiety insurance. I love that. I think that's pretty funny. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that'd be quite an interesting concept. I think for me, like, public charging plays almost a smaller role in Australia because we have so much off-street parking. 70% of Australians have access to off-street parking, whereas it's nowhere near that amount in parts of Europe, Asia, parts of the US. Like you go to Singapore, like no one has a parking. You go to Hong Kong, like no one has a parking space. And so, and the beautiful cities of Europe, like it's hard to kind of get parking. And so the question then is, like that's why they focus so much on public charging. Whereas in Australia, I feel like it's a little bit different. And so that balance we still need to look at. But definitely, people who don't have an electric vehicle focus a lot on range and focus a lot on kind of range anxiety. But certainly the people who have electric vehicles hardly feel it. Like you never get range anxiety. So.
Yeah, but if anyone in the world has a right to feel range anxiety, I think Australia is the place, because people do drive a lot. I see people in Philippines, I remember at a conference, people worried about range anxiety. And I said, who have driven in this room 100 kilometers in the last 3 months in a day? There's only one person. I said, hey, it doesn't make sense, because in Australia, people will go weekend. I used to go. I mean, you drive 450 kilometers or even 500 both ways to go for fishing in the morning, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do
you find the attitudes of governments and people to electric vehicles where you are?
Well, I work with many countries. I think gradually the penny has sunk. Gradually, people are thinking in different places, for different reasons. Like countries like the Philippines, which imports more than $10 billion worth of oil every year. Electric vehicle makes sense because it improves your energy security. Talk about a country like Kyrgyz Republic in Central Asia, former Soviet. There they get a lot of secondhand European cars. So we was telling them that if you do not do anything about EV, you will be the dumping ground of internal combustion engine cars globally, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So there maybe makes sense for them to start doing a retrofit of traditional car to electric and send them back. So different people are looking at different, and two of our clients, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, they are looking at also establishing car manufacturing, battery manufacturing. They have access to lithium. They have very cheap electricity. So different people are looking at from a very different perspectives to the electric vehicle scenario.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's it's interesting that you kind of touched on car manufacturing and battery kind of manufacturing. In Australia, the conversation really has been about, number one, the environment, obviously, and number two, kind of consumer kind of outcomes, right? Consumer choice, stuff like that. Very little attention paid to the industry development angle for electrification. Whereas we all know that globally, lots of countries are seeing electric vehicle transition as a way to build up industry. Whether it be around car manufacturing like in China, battery manufacturing like in China, or in the US or Europe. But in Australia, there's almost no conversation around, hey, let's kind of build an industry out of this, right? It's kind of like, oh, it's too hard. Let's just dig our lithium out and export it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the saddest part, because now Australia is sort of exporting a tons of lithium, right? Like anywhere larger than anyone else in the world, and then bringing back that same lithium and lithium-ion batteries. It doesn't make sense. I mean, Australia did with the iron ore, tons of them many years ago, but right now with all the smart people, young people like yourself, it doesn't make sense anymore, right?
Yeah, and I think this kind of stuff requires government vision and support, and it's just not there. It's not, and it's hard to convey the opportunities out there. But yeah, it's not something we've had much traction on. And pointing to other countries doesn't really help, it doesn't seem. So a lot of the focus has been making sure that we set up the charging infrastructure to prepare for the vehicles when they do come. In Victoria, the state that I'm based, will be the first developed kind of state in the world to put a tax on EVs rather than incentivize them. So we're switching to a road user charge only for electric vehicles and not for internal combustion engine vehicles. And so it's kind of crazy a little bit how we all got it backwards. But yeah, that's the mindset, unfortunately. But what it does mean is kind of a greater emphasis on the private sector's role for development of the industry. And I think that's where Australia really excels, in that young companies like ours, with really starting from scratch, nothing too much kind of history behind it, will get the opportunities with the large organizations. So, if you're a young startup and you kind of walk into, BP or Shell globally and say, hey, let's work together on EV charging and stuff like that, they're going to tell you to go away, right? Here in Australia, even the biggest companies will essentially give you a go, especially when we were building the industry together. And that's been really encouraging for me. When I talk to my overseas colleagues about what happens in Europe and US and stuff like that, they all say to me that a company like JetCharge probably wouldn't have been possible in those larger countries, because we do the full gamut of EV charging, like everything: domestic, commercial, huge public, apartments. Whereas in those countries, they have companies that kind of do each one of those things fairly well and just concentrate on doing those things. And so there's no one who does like this huge, end-to-end everything. And I think that's where we've been a little bit blessed, that it's been a little bit slower, because it's allowed us to develop our company and become that holistic provider. And so I feel pretty lucky to be in that position.
But still, I think we both agree that Australia needs to look at the manufacturing side of EV, because the time that I have spent with EV since 2010, I see that any Australian brand car, the same car coming from any other Asian neighbors in the Philippines, and coming with an Australian brand name will have a 30% margin, because Australia Inc. has that reliable, credible, and that factor. So why is no one manufacturing Australia? I know Gregory is doing with the AES EV, but that's a very
Yeah.
small setup.
Yeah.
He's quite hyped up about that, and which is fantastic. What are you doing with EV Council? Is the EV Council lobbying?
Yes. So, I mean, the EV Council has evolved a lot over the past few years as well. I've been chair for about a couple of years now. And I mean, my main focus is to make sure that the organisation is represented by the right members. And so for me, like, we spend a lot of time talking with government about opportunities, and we've now managed to make electric vehicles an election issue in 2 elections. So the last election, there was a huge amount dedicated to electric vehicles. And in this election, our opposition party has come out with a comprehensive EV plan. So Labor's come out with a comprehensive EV plan, which I'm sure the coalition will have to respond to. So, because of the great work that the EV Council's done, especially Behad Jafari, who's the CEO, it means that it's on the public consciousness, even though our uptake is less than 1% of new vehicle sales. Right? So we are doing that. We've lobbied really hard for us to look at manufacturing in Australia because of our facilities and our talent. Greg's business is a good example. We've got C Electric in Victoria who are doing trucks. We've got bus manufacturers who are building buses and chassis here in Australia, but using overseas tech. So like using BYD, Yutong, Proterra from the US. So no kind of like independent intellectual property creation. And the ironic thing is that, we've got companies like VinFast who are producing EVs in Vietnam, doing all of their quality assurance and research and development here in Australia, and like testing here in Australia, because of the capability and prowess of our engineers over here, and then getting it made in Vietnam. And so we're helping VinFast at the moment. They took over all of Holden's facilities in Victoria, and all the Holden people transferred over, right? And they're making electric cars in Vietnam. If I were kind of in the government portfolio looking at this kind of stuff, I think I would be trying to engage with all of the new vehicle manufacturers who are kind of pretty successful and are looking to set up factories globally. If you look at what Tesla's doing with their gigafactories, you look at what Arrival is doing, kind of doing microfactories globally, we should be trying to make, Australia a destination for that. Creating kind of skills and knowledge within the Australian kind of like professional sphere, so that, we can one day do something ourselves. Because right now what we're facing is purely a technology taker role in this country. Like, you've been working on this for so long. This is a once in several generation opportunity to kind of rejig where you sit in the automotive supply chain, right?
Yeah. Australia had CSIRO, as we all know, was the inventor of Wi-Fi, and then a lot of solar tech came out of University of New South Wales. I think the time has come that, it's sad, because there must be huge skill base of car manufacturing sitting in Broadmeadows and Clayton from the old Nissan factories and other factories, no?
Yeah, and look, we've still got the Nissan casting plant making stuff for the Nissan Leaf, but they're few and far between. And look, what we're trying to encourage the government to think about as well is that automotive is no longer just building vehicles. It's also about, software for autonomous driving. It's about charging that we're doing. It's about all this other stuff, right? Sensors, high-tech components, all of those things, right? But we don't have a strategy or plan around encouraging that kind of industry at all. If you look at all the charging companies in Australia, we have one charging company that's achieved any kind of scale, and that's us, right? And we have, only a couple of businesses, like Tritium, for example, does the charging manufacturing, and they go kind of global. But they didn't get there because of the Australian government's involvement, right? They did that as a private enterprise with a little bit of support from the Queensland government at the start. But yeah, so there's Tritium, who are the biggest, then there's us, and we're really the only two companies that are creating any kind of intellectual property and trying to contribute and hire people and stuff like that. But there should be hundreds more of us. If you look globally, like at all the kind of just the charging companies in US, Europe, China, there's
all over
hundreds.
Asia. All over Asia. There's tons and tons of opportunities coming in, especially some of the smaller electric vehicle, whether it's a two-wheeler or three-wheeler. You should be able to 3D print them and control the tech out of Australia or anywhere else, right? Because the huge support base, as you mentioned, is not just a physical car, a few nuts and bolts and metal. It's a lot of IP wrapped around it and a software, hardware, right? And a lot of those things, even you might be a small startup doing something somewhere in Melbourne. That can immediately be downloaded by millions of hundreds of millions of people globally. That sort of IP will only happen when you have the ecosystem, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things I've been really concentrating on is creating at least some environment of inspiration for the next generation of startups. Like last year, the top 10 startups in Australia, best funded startups in Australia, only one was in renewable energy, and that was Power Ledger out of WA. And they got a lot of funding because, well, the rise of kind of digital currency, right? So their digital currency went up a lot, and that's how they got a lot of funding. But if they kind of just did things normally, they probably wouldn't be in the top 10. And for me, I'm kind of like, in Australia, you're more likely to start a mattress company than you are to start a renewable energy company. Like, that is the truth. There are more mattress companies here than there are charging companies. It's crazy. And yet renewable energy is the thing that's going to like propel us onto the global stage, whether it be green hydrogen, whether it be solar and wind integration with EV charging, all of those things. But if you're coming out of uni and you're looking at what you want to tackle as an engineer, right, and the problems that you want to go into, you're not going to pick electric vehicles.
Seriously, not?
You're not going to pick electric vehicles. Can you come out and you go, what sales environment? Like no one's buying electric vehicles here. What government support is there? Nothing. What are the policies? None. Whereas if you come out of the Netherlands, right?
Yeah.
And you come out of Norway, or you even come out of Singapore, where the government has now like said we are going to go hard on EVs, right? And you're an engineer.
Took a long time. Yeah. Singapore took a long time, but I'm much more hopeful about Australia, of course. Looking from outside looking in, you are in the EV industry.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I'm extremely hopeful and optimistic. I think if you work in the EV sector in Australia, you have to be patient and optimistic. That's the one quality that I do have. And we keep pushing every day. But I feel like this year and towards the kind of 6 months of last year, even with COVID, I feel like the global arms race in relation to electric vehicles has really accelerated.
Yes.
And you feel it in the kind of collective air, if you like, with people's activity, the attention that people are giving to it. You feel like it's really accelerating. And I do feel like even though eventually we will have electric vehicles in Australia, everyone will drive electric vehicles, that's all cool. I feel like we will miss out on the key component for our country, which is creating an industry designed to support the new automotive sector. I think we will just end up being consumers rather than technology creators, and that saddens me. And I basically go, well, like if the global trend is accelerating and everyone's pouring money into it and capital and systems and infrastructure and supply chains, and we don't do those things, the pieces will be set, and so anyway, I'm still hopeful, but I do feel like time is starting to run out because, if you want to establish yourselves as a battery manufacturing hub because of our raw materials, the time to do that is now because the big OEMs are signing decade-long contracts for supply. And instead of them just signing us to supply the lithium, they should be signing us to produce the batteries. And even if we have to partner with overseas firms to set up the first factory so we don't have to do everything from scratch, I think that's okay, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I talked to a lot of different people. There are interests to set up in Australia, but somehow the two and two didn't work together, it seems, no? Because Australia
Yeah.
has a ready-made market, at least the battery in homes. It's a huge market out there, right?
Huge market. Huge market. And, there's a reason why Australia was the first launch market for the Tesla Powerwall outside of the US.
Mhm.
It's because they saw it as a huge opportunity because so many of us have solar.
Mhm.
And so you've got a really fantastic domestic market that you can serve.
Mhm.
And yeah, there are lots of people who are interested, but there's no, I guess, proactive government engagement.
Mhm.
There's no like red carpet. As
Yeah.
Behad would say, if you kind of wanted to set up an electric vehicle factory in any of the Southeast Asian countries, you're greeted by influential politicians. If you want to set up something in Australia, you're greeted by the Electric Vehicle Council. Like that's kind of that's the difference, right? And I feel like we could be doing more to encourage that. But at the same time, I've got to tell you, like I think Australian consumers are ready for EVs. Um, More than 50% of Australians would consider purchasing an EV as their next vehicle.
Mhm.
And as I think when we hit price parity, whenever that is in Australia, latter half of this decade, I guess, I think we'll start to see adoption accelerate. So yeah, but I don't know. Like it is going to take a long time, but I always say it doesn't really matter when the hockey stick adoption curve starts. It doesn't matter whether it's 2025 or 2028. The only thing that matters is, are you prepared for the rate of change?
Mhm.
Because the rate of change is like crazy and incredible. And I don't think we're really ready for the rate of change. Everyone's trying to predict the bottom of the market, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, other way of marketing this also. I just recently bought a car, and I was thinking that, okay, this is the last ICE car that I'm going to buy because
Yeah.
don't have much choice here in the Philippines. But I'm saying that message come in because it's also a stranded asset risk, right? If you're buying a brand new car and you say, oh, that car, I'm going to be unable to sell that in 2025 and beyond because people will buy electric cars. So that's something people have to think, right? We used to drive many, many years ago, a Statesman. I remember
Yep.
a V8 when we tried to sell it, I think 2013 or whenever. And suddenly the price drop was humongous. And I said, what's
Yeah.
gone wrong? Then I realized market is no longer buying those humongous cars. So I
Yeah,
think
that's
people
right.
also have to be wary of that factor in the consumer side of it. It's not today price parity, it's also tomorrow's stranded asset risk, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of those decisions will be made for consumers
Mhm.
because a lot of consumers now, retail consumers especially, are financing their vehicles.
Mhm.
So either lease or novated lease or just general finance, vehicle finance. And what's happening, what I think will happen, is that those finance companies are going to start taking a pretty dim view of the residual values of the vehicles.
So they pass the risk.
So, the residual values might be way lower than what they were previously saying because they're like, well, by the time your 5-year term is up and we have
Mhm.
to sell this thing, then we think we'll only get, 20% or 30% rather than 50%. And
Mhm.
so because they price that residual risk in, your
Mhm.
monthly repayments go up.
Yeah. So you pass the risk to the customers. Customers will take it without knowing them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But they'll look at the repayments and they'll go, hang on, why are these repayments so high? Like I bought, a Mazda 3 or a Corolla, like 2 years ago, and it was way lower. They're like, because of residual risk. And then you compare that against the finance cost of an electric vehicle. And I think what we're going to start seeing is price parity in relation to finance costs before you see price parity in relation to dealer price. And price parity in relation to finance costs is going to be really important because a lot of us finance our vehicles. I think up to 50%
Mhm.
finance the vehicles. And so hopefully we'll see some kind of adoption curve acceleration before dealer price parity because of that.
Yeah, I think the finance cost people may not see. Also, the interest rate is so low; it's very difficult to compare in the
Yes.
so with something in the past. No, but I think
Yes.
definitely if somebody, these leasing companies, uh, sort of package it in with your charging infrastructure cost, then people will start saying, "Oh, I get this car, all I pay is X per month, including my charging cost, and the other one I top up $50 a week." So I think that difference, that could be one way also looking at it, no?
I think that will happen. Certainly in Australia, for example, AGL has a car subscription program where
Mhm.
they include everything, cars, charging. Like we work with them on that, electricity. And the interesting thing about EVs is that it just provides a lot more opportunity for more companies to get involved in fuel.
Mhm.
Because if you think about the fueling supply chain, it's actually pretty narrow globally.
Mhm.
There are not that many companies involved really. Like the kind of, the actual production, refineries, then downstream assets. If you added up all of those companies globally, it's actually a pretty small group of really large businesses. Um, but with the electricity, because it's much easier and it's localized, there's so many more players. Like all of a sudden, your leasing company might team up with an electricity retailer to do exactly what you said, which is to supply everything.
Yeah.
Um, your insurance company might be your fueling provider. Do
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like it's anything, I just think I say to my retail clients, you won't believe this, but in the next decade, you could be some of the largest distributors of electricity in the country.
Yeah. Yeah. Why is not RACV doing that? They have all those consumer base, right? RACV
Yeah,
brand is quite strong.
yeah. So I mean, RACV have invested in one of my businesses, ChargeFox,
Ah, okay.
and in fact, all the clubs have, and so and they see it as a big member benefit, right? They get
Mhm.
discounts on the ChargeFox network, and they're pretty kind of bullish about the EV future because NRMA, for example, built I think the first petrol station in Australia with Caltex,
Mhm.
and so they've been involved in fueling for a really long time. What this allows them to do is to actually take the fueling power back, um, and be able to be the main provider for their members, which I think is rather than just getting a discount, at the various petrol stations, they can actually take full control. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
I remember was it in the Philippines or Indonesia? I can't remember. Maybe both. I was sitting with someone quite some years back, and his interest was that, is there a company out there that who can come and put a charging station in all my gasoline network, petrol
Mm,
stations? So
mm,
of course, you are able to do that in Australia, but I think
yes.
it's a huge market out there in all over Asia, including the Philippines. Just
Yeah.
making that announcement that we have a roadmap to do that by 2025 will get a lot of brownie points for anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think countries with some kind of target will
Mhm.
always attract investment. And certainly, I think the environment is ripe, especially within Southeast Asia, for a well-funded, sophisticated group to come in and say, "We'll help you electrify the country."
Mhm.
So
Yes,
not just about we'll sell you some charging stations. Your ABB, you go into these countries and you go, "I'll sell you a charger," right? And you might sell 5 or 10 or whatever. But I think if you believe in the EV transition and the EV story, then absolutely, I think there is a big market to kind of going and say, we're going to take the risk on EV adoption. We know that EVs are coming, and we're going to electrify the entire country's worth of transport. And so I don't think those days are too far off. I don't know. I'm sure you see more than I do, doing the work that you do, but certainly in Australia, like I think the time is ripe for a new asset class.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and I think that's important because, if you look at where data centers were, a decade ago, they weren't an asset class. They are now. I think charging infrastructure will be the same.
Yeah, I mean, I had a proposal to finance a project, and it got delayed. It might still happen in a country called Georgia in Central Asia
Hmm.
or Caucasus. The idea was basically electric charging infrastructure doesn't exist. So if we want to talk to the power regulator and create an asset class, if you like, a monopoly asset class, saying, I give you team exclusivity for charging for next 5 years.
Mm.
You can set up as many as you want, but in return, we'll regulate the tariff. So you come an arrangement. So you created a regulated monopoly, and then you said, yeah, okay. And the ADB, our plan was to finance a whole range of electric cars at the sort of with the policy level, working with the government. So suddenly we could say we have a private sector partner who will charge the charging infrastructure. As long as the demands rise, they will meet the demand. And
Yes.
the taxpayers are not taking any risk at all. So something like that can also work in Australia, no? If you go to outside the country in the remote areas and work with the regulator saying, no one coming in, give me an exclusive monopoly, no?
Yeah, I think it'd be harder in Australia, to be honest. Our grid is fairly fractured in terms of the number of players. So I think that would probably take a really long time. But I think any countries with a state-owned grid, where basically it's all kind of just one entity and more government involvement, I think that would certainly be possible. I think the biggest issue that we all face at the moment is that there actually aren't that many companies out there who understand how to roll out charging infrastructure effectively.
Okay.
And I think also that a lot of people view charging infrastructure like they view fueling assets, like traditional petrol stations, which is we need a lot of petrol stations, right? We need a lot of charging stations. But I think the difference with charging infrastructure is that it is an amalgamation of a whole lot of different assets. Each of those, even the large charging infrastructure projects, a single site are like less than 10 mil, So as a project finance kind of thing, it's just not big enough.
Yes.
But if you aggregate all of those assets together into essentially what is an aggregation fund, that's probably a lot more interesting. But I think we're a little bit far off from that. But I think in Southeast Asian countries, there's definitely a role to play. Like what you just talked about in Georgia, I'm kind of going, consumers get a good outcome because it's a regulated tariff, so they're not getting ripped off. Private sector gets investment security, and they have an incentive to roll out more things. Governments have now an incentive to bring in the vehicles because they know that the charging infrastructure will be there. So those kind of deals are there to be done for sure, but probably not in Australia.
Okay, I'll find someone. I get a lot of those calls from senior government officials and something.
Yeah.
So if you have interest to expand into Asia,
Absolutely.
I can send a lot of people your way.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you for kind of raising that. It's quite timely, so that's good.
Yeah, because we get to meet people who said, yeah, we don't need money. Then we don't need this. We have all the political plans. We have this and that. What do you finally need? But then the often the outcome is that we need someone to stitch this together. And then for ADB to come in, the discussion is what is the development angle, right? Is this priority in our country? So it's very difficult for us to sometimes engage in if it's a small play. So I think then people like yourself can be very useful saying, okay, go and talk to Tim. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I often find that bigger plays are sometimes easier than smaller
bigger
plays.
Players actually easier. Yeah, bigger players.
But where this is the kind of stuff that I'm saying to the government because Jet Charge, for example, is backed by the Australian government. We got investment from the Clean Energy Fund, which is called the Clean Energy Finance Corporation in Australia. And their vision, my view has always been that the charging stations themselves don't really matter. The only thing that matters is the electrons that come out of those charging stations. You can buy any box, you'll buy hundreds of different brands. It's really about the outcome that they deliver. And that outcome is confidence in fueling. So no matter what you do as a consumer, if you have an EV, you want to be able to make sure you come up to that station and you get the fuel that you need. Nobody cares about petrol pumps. Nobody knows the brands of petrol pumps or anything like that. Nobody understands the brands of the meter in your house to measure electricity, right? Charging will be exactly the same. You just want the outcome. And so, I think there probably is a role to play for someone to bring it all together. And that's how we've grown in Australia, is we're the company that's brought it all together for lots of different brands and corporates. But yeah, something interesting to think about for sure.
Yeah, I mean, are you keeping an eye on what's happening at the COP26, that is large climate conference this time in the UK? And the UK
Yeah.
government has a lot of funding to support EV-related things. Are you
Well,
somehow?
that's why you see some of the absolute best startups for EVs as well as EV charging come out of the UK. I mean, that's not an accident. That's like people like, Podpoint and Arrival and all these guys, they're coming out of the UK, which is a right-hand drive market, right? A tiny like car market in the grand scheme of things. But some of the best startups come from there. Shell and BP concentrated their activities over there. It's because of government. It's because even like the conservative government coming out and saying, we want this. We want to be good at this. We want to be the leader in this, and we're going to bring our targets forward. Holy crap. So anyway, yes, I am aware of what's happening in UK. My view is that, those countries will start kind of playing themselves out now, like the US, Europe, China, UK. But I think where a lot of the opportunities now is kind of going to countries that don't have as much collective will yet. And exactly as you said, all through Southeast Asia, to kind of go and present these options to them to get them started. Because once they do get started, you kind of look at Singapore, for example, it took a long time, but now that they've gotten started, like it's really the momentum is building hard. Same with Hong Kong. So I think the opportunities are there.
Okay, I think there are a lot of opportunities. Dust needs to settle a bit more.
Yes.
What's your advice to young entrepreneurs? We touched upon that a bit. What can they do to get into this space?
I think take an interest, first of all, in renewable energy and the electrification of transport. Recognize that the role it's going to play. And I would encourage the small batch of entrepreneurs out there who are not just looking for an exit, who are not just looking to make a quick buck, to invest some time into looking at the impact that they will make if they decide to invest their time into renewable energy and electrification. I think avoid a lot of the startup culture as much as you can and concentrate on the things that matter. And the things that matter is what makes you content as a business person and what makes you feel like you're making a difference. I don't think there's anything wrong with starting a business with the aim of just selling it very quickly and making lots of money. And if you're that type of person, don't get into renewable energy or EVs. But if you're the type of if you're the type of person who wants to start a company to actually make an impact, have a look at electric vehicles. And I think you can get into it pretty easily, to be honest. You can basically join a business that's already started, or you could look at how you can serve the community around you and start education. And I always say start small, start tangible, create something that you can actually do. Because the best piece of advice that I ever got when I started the business was from an ex-employee of Better Place. Back then, the best funded EV charging startup globally. And they said, we had too many consultants and not enough engineers, and that's why we failed. They said, just concentrate on putting infrastructure in the ground and just don't look up. And before you know it, you'll be the biggest and most experienced in the country because you focus on the things that matter. Because if you're going to be an infrastructure company, your job is to put infrastructure in the ground. It's not to do all this other crap, right? And so I followed that advice, and that's exactly what happened. And I would say the same thing to young people everywhere. But it is not an easy road, but it is an incredibly satisfying road to essentially see that what you're doing is priming the entire country for a new generation of automotive transport. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's important to have something tangible. With that, thank you very much, Tim, for your time.
Thank you.
We really learned a lot.
Great. It was great to catch up.
Yeah, let's keep in touch. Okay.
Absolutely. Okay. Cheers.
Okay. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us this week. If you haven't done so yet, subscribe to our show. Also, leave your comments and review if you enjoyed today's episode. Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter at @shasni for updates. That's SHASNI. Once again, this has been Energypreneurs, connecting you to the innovative opportunities in solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles. Stay tuned.